Hey, we are back with Stephen Smoot. He's a doctoral candidate in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literature at the Catholic University of America. He previously earned a master's degree from the University of Toronto in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations with a concentration in Egyptology and bachelor's degrees from BYU in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, focusing on the Hebrew Bible and German studies. He's currently an adjunct instructor of religious education at BYU and a research associate with the B.H. Roberts Foundation.
Thank you for having me. As the last and certainly least of all the speakers at this conference, I'll just say how much I've enjoyed the other papers from my co-conferenciers, I guess, and I'm happy to be here. The nice thing about being last is I can go as long as I want, right? Because there's no one waiting for me. So.
I will cut you off.
Okay, well, I'm being told I'll be cut off, so I'll try my best to end on time. So I'm here today to discuss basically the nomenclature that Latter-day Saints have used to discuss the Book of Mormon. With the question I want to address, is the Book of Mormon a translation or a revelation? What's the best nomenclature to use when describing the Book of Mormon, right? I will refer listeners and viewers to the full version of my paper that I understand will be published in the proceedings of this conference, but for now I'll do my best to kind of summarize the most salient points. So let's start off with kind of framing the problem we have here. Or I say a problem, people have kind of turned it into a problem, I guess. So as probably everybody here watching knows, Joseph Smith maintained throughout his ministry and life that he had translated, those are his words, he had translated the Book of Mormon from ancient golden plates by what he called the gift and power of God. And I've given some samples there from both his early ministry towards the end of his life, showing he very consistently uses this language and terminology. So the listener might be wondering, so what's the problem here, right? Well, the problem that some people have identified is that recently some church leaders, such as Elder Suarez recently in the April 2020 General Conference, have said remarks such as this, quote, "This sacred ancient record was not translated in the traditional way that scholars would translate ancient texts by learning an ancient language. We ought to look at the process more like a revelation with the aid of physical instruments provided by the Lord as opposed to a translation by one with a knowledge of languages." So Elder Suarez in recent General Conference says that we should understand the Book of Mormon more as a revelation and less as a quote-unquote translation in the sort of conventional academic sense. He's not alone in this. There's other general authorities who have sort of intimated these things, church authors, Latter-day Saint scholars and historians of various stripes, but he kind of is a representative recent sample. Now, this, of course, raises some interesting questions if we follow what Elder Suarez is saying. Is this manner of describing the Book of Mormon more in terms of revelation rather than translation a recent phenomenon? Is it just recently that Latter-day Saints have started discussing the book in these terms? And if that's the case, then is this somehow a sign, perhaps, that Latter-day Saints are backing away or backing down from the historicity of the Book of Abraham, or that it isn't actually a real translation, as some critics allege, and I'll show an example in a second, right? So that's a corollary question some have posed. And this kind of also dovetails to this other question: how have Latter-day Saints historically described the nature of the Book of Mormon text? So those are some related questions that kind of come up together when approaching it from this angle. Now, to give you an example of some recent critics of the church who have latched on to Elder Suarez's remarks at General Conference, this is from the anti-Mormon website Mormon Stories, where the author who posted this quotes Elder Suarez and then says, "This, my friends, is gaslighting." Just very straightforward. That's our favorite phrase these days. You hear it all the time by people that don't know what gaslighting is, but oh well, that's what it is. It is gaslighting, right? So that's one example. Here's another example from another anti-Mormon website. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it might even be the same author. I forgot to double check. But the author is going through this lengthy polemic about how the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham can't be real translations. And this critic latches onto the quote by Elder Suarez here. And after quoting Elder Suarez, this critic says, "To say that this is a completely different explanation of the Book of Mormon than I was given as an investigator 25 years ago is an understatement." And goes on to say, "This shows how the church realizes that the idea of a tight translation is impossible to defend against the evidence." So in this critic's thinking, Elder Suarez is sort of sheepishly conceding that the Book of Mormon is not actually a translation, and so he's retreating into the language of revelation as a way to sort of play it safe in the face of this overwhelming evidence, as this critic alleges. So that's an interesting question, right? Is this true? Is this some sort of tactical retreat into the language of revelation as opposed to translation? in order to sort of salvage the Book of Mormon in the face of overwhelming evidence? Well, I want to address that question here. So the methodology I had for this paper as I was looking into this question, it's actually pretty straightforward, the methodology I have. The first thing I want to do is I want to analyze how Joseph Smith's revelations that he receives coterminous with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, so this would have been between 28 and 29, how do these revelations describe the text and its production? I think that's an interesting question and an interesting way to sort of test this claim. I'm interested in looking how the first generation of Latter-day Saints describe the book and its production, and so I'll show examples of that. And specifically, I think it's worthwhile to focus on, I'll call them orthodox sources, Latter-day Saints, as representative of mainline or normative thinking among the early Latter-day Saints, right? So nobody who's really fringe or far out there, but people that you would be reading in church publications, people who had prominent positions in church leadership, who were respected authorities on the Book of Mormon in 19th century Latter-day Saint discourse and culture. So that lays out sort of briefly a methodology I think that can help us address this question, right? So let's get right to it with Joseph Smith's revelations that he received at the time that he produced the Book of Mormon. As a matter of fact, if you look at multiple revelations received at this time, you see unmistakably the fact that the production of the Book of Mormon is described as a revelatory event, and that the text is a revelatory translation that was specifically rendered by Joseph's power and ability as a God-ordained seer, right? And I'll sort of wrap this all up later, but this is basically sections 3, 5, 6, 8, 10, and 20. They all contain this sort of language and these sorts of references, right? So let's start with D&C 3. This is in the July of 1828 in connection with Martin Harris's loss of 116 pages. And in it, this revelation says that God had given Joseph, and in the original manuscript, in the Revelation manuscript book, it says, right to translate. You can see there underlined, right to translate. This is revised and printed in the printed Revelation as sight and power to translate. So in the thinking of Joseph and his scribes preparing this text for publication, they tweaked the language a little bit to make it much more evocatively Syriac-like. So Joseph had a right from God to translate, but this right is actually sight and power to translate. So right off the bat, you see something very interesting there, this conceptual linkage of a revelatory right with Syriac power specifically to translate. So that's an easy example from D&C section 3. Here's D&C section 5, received in March of 1829, where it says, I've underlined the portion that show unto him that I, the Lord, am God, and have given these things unto him. These things referring both to the actual objects Joseph is working with and the power to render those objects, right? And down later in a few lines it says, and he hath no power over them, meaning power to understand or translate or interpret them, the plates, except it be granted, except I grant it unto him. He hath no gift to translate the book, and he hath a gift to translate the book. So Joseph doesn't have the ability to translate the book except if he gets it through a revelation, as what's here called a gift. So he has the gift to translate the book because God has given him the power, and he only has the power when God gives it to him, right? That's very clear from section 5 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 6 of the Doctrine and Covenants, received in April of 1829, is interesting because Oliver Cowdery gets roped into the translation process. April of 1829 is when Oliver meets Joseph Smith and becomes a scribe in the translation of the Book of Mormon, and Joseph receives this revelation to Oliver, explaining that Oliver too has a gift. This is from the Book of Commandments printing of the Revelation. Behold, thou hast a gift which is said to be sacred and cometh from above. So Oliver's ability to participate as a scribe in the translation, his assistance in producing this text, is a gift that comes from above. And later on in the Revelation, God even gives unto you and also unto my servant Joseph the keys of this gift, evoking almost like priesthood language, it seems almost. But again, this idea of they've been given keys and power and ability specifically from God as it cometh from above. That is, it is revelatory. It is revelation. So that's D&C section 6. This is my favorite example, is D&C section 8, also received in April of 1829, the same month that Joseph meets Oliver. Again, this is a revelation to Oliver Cowdery in which God says to Oliver that you have a knowledge concerning the engravings of old records which are ancient. So we're clearly establishing this is an ancient historic artifact. We're establishing the historicity of this and the antiquity of this book. But specifically, this knowledge Oliver gets is by the manifestation of my Spirit and by the Holy Ghost. That's made explicit here. This is defined as, quote, the spirit of revelation that Oliver has as he is assisting Joseph Smith in the production of the book. And later, there's this famous passage where Oliver is said to have the gift of working with the, and in the original manuscript, it's the sprout. That is crossed out there and replaced with rod, and when it gets printed, it's called "Thou hast the gift of Aaron," right? This is this famous textual evolution of this passage. So the imagery here is that Joseph is, if we want to relate it to Old Testament prophets, Joseph is Moses, Oliver is Aaron. Oliver has the ability to work miracles and wonders with this rod or this sprout or this staff that God has provided for him, right? And later when this revelation gets published, that's linked to this gift that Aaron has. So go read your book of Exodus if you want to see what the relationship looks like there or how it's envisioned to look like, right? Joseph is the Moses receiving revelation. Oliver Cowdery is the Aaron co-participating in this, also receiving revelatory power as he participates with Joseph. And the reason this is my favorite example is because when John Whitmer copies this into the manuscript Revelation book, he provides a superscription at the top, and he describes it as a revelation to Oliver, he being desirous to know whether the Lord would grant him the gift of, and you'll see here, he initially writes revelation, and then he strikes it out and replaces it with translation. So John Whitmer can't decide what best to describe this as. Does Oliver have a gift for revelation or translation? And I think because the answer is in the minds of early Latter-day Saints, the two were very closely linked. So this is a clear example where even early Latter-day Saints go back and forth with this language of revelation or translation, trying to decide what's the best one to use. We see it there in John Whitmer's copy of the manuscript. D&C section 10, on the left I have the Book of Commandments printing, and on the right I have the expanded version as it appeared in the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. In D&C section 10, Joseph is again given, quote, power to translate, right? This power having been lost for a time because of his involvement with the 116 pages, the loss of the pages that he was partly responsible for. But it's been restored to you again. So in other words, Joseph's ability to translate, this power to translate, it is external of Joseph. It is given or taken to him as God sees fit, depending on Joseph's actions and behavior. When this gets printed in the Doctrine and Covenants, it's expanded. It says here, I have given you power to translate by the means of the Urim and Thummim. So the Syric instruments, the seer stones, are explicitly linked as being the power, the medium through which this revelatory power operates, and that this was given by God to Joseph, the power of which was given to him, right? So section 10 is another clear example of these two categories being collapsed on each other. Finally, my last example here is section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants from what's called the Articles and Covenants of the Church, received in April of 1830, just a few weeks after the Book of Mormon is published. This was one of the earliest published accounts we get of the translation of the Book of Mormon that's coming from Joseph Smith. And so it's significant that it represents an early published account from the prophet. And in it, God, right, talks about how he had called Joseph, he sent him an holy angel, gave unto him commandments, and that God gave unto him power from on high, by the means of which were before prepared, referring to the seer stones, the Urim and Thummim, to translate the Book of Mormon. In the same breath, power from on high, revelatory power, is linked with this ability to translate the Book of Mormon. It's very clear and explicit in the Articles and Covenants of the Church, right, section 20. So that's kind of the wrap-up, the blitzkrieg wrap-up, right, of these revelations. Again, we could, in my paper, I go more in depth in them, explaining my thinking here, but those samples hopefully should suffice. So what's the takeaway here? Well, from these examples, we can see why Joseph Smith repeatedly affirmed that he had translated the book by what he calls the gift and power of God. That's the language that his revelations given to him that he produces describe the coming forth and production of this book. So it makes sense why Joseph describes it in those terms. It also explains why when Joseph Smith does publicly rehearse the details about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, he uses language like this. So this is in 1840 in Washington, D.C., when Joseph is out there to address Congress for a petition of redress for the wrongs of the saints. He's publicly speaking in the city, and we have this record of him speaking where he says to the congregation that that the Book of Mormon was, quote, communicated to him direct from heaven, and that emphasis is in the original. It's underlined in the original minutes. Direct from heaven. So Joseph is emphasizing it as he's talking, and that he had penned it as it was dictated to him by God. So Joseph is telling people in public that he received the text by revelation, quote, direct from heaven, right? It also explains why, well, I'll get to this example, I guess, a little bit later. But again, his own revelations use this language and they make that connection. His revelations overtly collapse these categories together and link them together conceptually. And I believe it's because they operate under his capacity as a seer, right? It also explains, this is the letter I wanted to show from James, to James Arlington Bennett, dated 13 November 1843. This is actually cited by Elder Suarez in his remarks at General Conference. But Joseph Smith, or I suppose William Phelps, ghostwriting for Joseph Smith, but we'll say Joseph Smith as the ultimate authority of this letter, he says to James Arlington Bennett, quote, by the power of God, I translated the Book of Mormon from hieroglyphics, the knowledge of which was lost to the world, in which wonderful event I stood alone, an unlearned youth, to combat the worldly wisdom and multiplied ignorance of 18 centuries with a new revelation. So I have them highlighted there. Again, in the same, almost the same sentence, Joseph is saying, I have translated the Book of Mormon with a new revelation, right? So in his letters that he's writing, he also makes this connection very clear. So that does it for Joseph Smith. Again, sort of a whirlwind tour through some of the examples we get from him that I think are useful and interesting. Let's look a little bit at how early Latter-day Saints and others describe the Book of Mormon. Do they describe it in similar terms? I'd like to start with this fellow, Dietrich Willers, who is a reverend with the German Reformed Church that the Whitmer family is involved with. So this Reverend Willers, or Willers, I have to say, having done German, right, at BYU, Herr Willers knows the Whitmer family. He's an early recipient of the Book of Mormon from the Whitmers, and he writes a letter to fellow reverends in his church, in his ecclesiastical organization. He writes to other reverends he knows describing this new book, this Golden Bible, Book of Mormon stuff, but he specifically says that he got this from the Whitmers. So the account that he gets, he says he's relaying from the Whitmers, whom he knows and whom he has been speaking with about how this book came forward. This is D. Michael Quinn, who did a great article on this letter. Aside from its obvious and sometimes comical bias, the letter contains some important insights into the first month of the restored Church of Jesus Christ. His account of the manner in which Joseph Smith obtained and translated the Book of Mormon is a fairly accurate version of the Mormon account of this matter, referring specifically to the Whitmers, right? Quinn says that there is a subtle but important insight provided by the letter concerning the method of the translation of the Book of Mormon. Willers discusses the role of the Urim and Thummim in the translation and records that although the Urim and Thummim was said to be indispensable, it was actually the impressions of the Holy Ghost to Joseph Smith which provided the translation. And this is the quote from the letter. So he, again, he's sort of paraphrasing what the Whitmers have told him. The angel indicated that the Lord destined him to translate these things into English from the ancient language, and that under these plates were hidden spectacles, without which he could not translate these plates, that by using these spectacles, he, Smith, would be in a position to read these ancient languages, which he had never studied, and that the Holy Ghost would reveal to him the translation in the English language. So via Dietrich Willers, the Whitmers understand this is what's happening. To confirm that, I looked at something John Whitmer says. So John Whitmer is one of the Whitmers who knows Dietrich Willers. He publishes this account in 1836 in the church's newspaper, and remember, John Whitmer is also one of the 8 witnesses of the Book of Mormon. He says, to say that the Book of Mormon is a revelation from God, I have no hesitancy. So John Whitmer is fine calling it a revelation. He's also fine calling it a translation. He says, I have handled these plates and know of a surety that Joseph Smith Jr. has translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. So John Whitmer is fine using both of these terms in his same article here published in the church's newspaper. What about guys like Oliver Cowdery, right? So we know Oliver Cowdery is preaching in late 1830. He goes over to Ohio with other missionaries, Parley Pratt and Ziba Peterson, and I think Peter Whitmer's the 4th one, I can't recall. They're preaching in Ohio, and we have newspaper accounts of their preachings. So what is Oliver Cowdery saying? According to the Observer and Telegraph in November of 1830, and they're paraphrasing Oliver here, I'll just read the highlighted section. To him they say, so referring to Joseph Smith, so the newspaper gives a recounting of how Joseph discovers the plates according to Oliver, and then to him, Joseph Smith, they say, meaning Oliver and the other missionaries, was given the spirit of interpretation, but as he was ignorant of the art of writing, he employed this Oliver Cowdery and others to write, while he read, interpreted, and translated this mighty revelation. Now, this is a second-hand paraphrase by the newspaper reporter, so you wonder, is it really accurate? Would Oliver really have said that? I think he probably would have, because other early missionaries, like Ezra Booth here, is calling the Book of Mormon a divine revelation. Ezra Booth will apostatize from the church, and these letters he writes in the context of criticizing and attacking Joseph Smith in the church. But he presents a representative example of an early Latter-day Saint missionary and how they would have been presenting the book to people as they encounter them. So Ezra Booth, to a degree, corroborates this. Samuel Smith, to a degree, corroborates this. So we have this recollection by Phineas Young, Brigham Young's brother, about meeting Samuel Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, in 1830 as Samuel sets out on a mission with the Book of Mormon. He gives this lengthy account of meeting Samuel, and I'll just read the highlighted portions. In Phineas Young's account, he meets Samuel, and they have this conversation, and it goes like this. So he asks him, "What's this book you have?" And then Samuel says, "The Book of Mormon, or as it is called by some, the Golden Bible." Phineas Young says, "Ah, sir, then it purports to be a revelation?" To which Samuel responds, "Yes," he said, "it is a revelation from God." So Samuel Smith reportedly is using this language. Again, he says it here, "Yes," said he, "I know that the book to be a revelation from God, translated by the gift and power of the Holy Ghost, and that my brother Joseph Smith Jr. is a prophet, seer, and revelator." In the same breath, Samuel Smith is reportedly using both words at the same time to describe this book. And then, for good measure, Phineas Young goes on to describe how he gains a testimony, he's converted, and he preaches a public sermon at the same time, and he calls it a revelation from God translated from the Reformed Egyptian language by Joseph Smith. So you've got 2 for 1 there. Both Phineas and Samuel are using both terms interchangeably, literally in the same sentence, right? Now, this is the final example I'll use, and then I'll wrap up. It's from Orson Pratt. I think it's fair to say that Orson Pratt represents a fairly safe, orthodox, mainstream, representative view of the Book of Mormon. Orson Pratt is one of the most influential Latter-day Saint writers of the early church and of the mid-19th century. His writings on the Book of Mormon are hugely influential even to this day. And so we are safe with going with Orson Pratt as an example of a true believing, orthodox, committed Latter-day Saint, and how they describe the Book of Mormon, I think, is instructive. Now, there's way too many examples for me to add here. Again, I have multiple examples in the full version of my paper. They come from works such as Divine Authority, published in 1848, Divine Authenticity of the Book of Mormon, published in 1850, and Orson Pratt's periodical The Seer, which is published between 1853 and 1854. As a little matter of show and tell, I hope I will allow the indulgence. I actually own a copy, a first edition printing of Divine Authenticity of the Book of Mormon from 1850. So this is a nice little treasure in my collection of these little pamphlets Orson Pratt collects here, or that he prints. I'll just read the opening. This is the opening sentence or two from it. The Book of Mormon claims to be a divinely inspired record written by a succession of prophets who inhabited ancient America. It professes to be revealed to the present generation for the salvation of all who will receive it, and for the overthrow and damnation of all nations who will reject it. From there, we have examples like this. I won't read through all of them necessarily. Perhaps your viewers can pause and watch if they want. Interchangeably throughout this series, Divine Authenticity of the Book of Mormon, interchangeably Pratt is using revelation and translation. Sometimes in the same paragraph or same sentence, such as this one here. I actually have the scan of the original, which I'll put up there. We can read it. After these plates had been exhibited to a sufficient number of witnesses, they were, by the commandment of God, hid up in charge of the heavenly messenger who first revealed them, and who had from time to time, while they were being translated, directed Mr. Smith how to preserve them from the hands of his persecutors. For persecution was so heavy upon him that he had to flee from place to place to preserve his life. A portion of these plates were sealed together, and Mr. Smith was forbidden to break the seal or to translate them. The Book of Mormon informs us that the sealed portion of the plates contains a very great and sacred revelation, unfolding things from the beginning of the world unto the end thereof, and that it is hereafter to be revealed by the power of Christ. The plates, therefore, will no doubt be kept in charge of the heavenly messenger until the time arrives for the seal to be loosed and for the remainder to be translated. So there you have it, back and forth in the same paragraph. Orson Pratt goes from describing the Book of Mormon as revealed to Joseph Smith, translated to Joseph Smith. The contents are said to be a revelation. The contents are said to be revealed in the future, and that Joseph had translated these. You see again right here very clearly how Orson is totally comfortable interchanging this terminology or nomenclature to describe the Book of Mormon, right? A few other examples, just for good measure, from Orson Pratt, and then I'll wrap up and be finished here. This is from another one of his publications done in 1856 on the topic of spiritual gifts, where he talks about, quote, the gift of translation by the inspiration of the Holy Ghost. Explicitly there, the translation is said to be a revelatory gift by the inspiration of the Holy Ghost. He talks about how Joseph was inspired by God to translate and to reveal these lost books. He talks about how by the gift of the Spirit, he translated the Book of Mormon. And again, by this gift, he translated. And what's interesting here, incidentally, is that Orson Pratt links the Book of Abraham and the Joseph Smith translation and Doctrine and Covenants section 7, all purported translations of ancient texts to varying degrees, but translations which are produced by revelation from Joseph Smith. Orson Pratt throws all of these together in the pot of Joseph has a spiritual gift from God to reveal lost books by means of sacred translation that God has given him the power of, right? So there's another example from Orson Pratt. And again, for good measure, here's a speech he gives in 1878 where he talks about how the first gifts that the Lord bestowed upon his people for the benefit of his people was that of revelation, i.e. the gift to translate by the aid of the Urim and Thummim, the gift of bringing to light old and ancient records, right? So again, let's read that again. Thus you see, one of the first gifts bestowed by the Lord for the benefit of his people was that of revelation, the gift to translate. Again, it's very clear in Orson's thinking that these two are conceptually linked, and that Joseph, as a seer, there it is, by aid of the Urim and Thummim, by aid of the seer stones, he has the gift, this revelatory gift and power to produce the translation. And he goes on to say, what a wonderful thing the Book of Mormon is, to be brought forth by an angel sent from heaven, to be translated from the ancient languages of this country into our English language, to have the Urim and Thummim given to the translator by which the words were translated. So again, in the same speech, Orson clearly goes between describing this as the gift of revelation and the gift of translation, and it is housed under the sort of umbrella of Joseph's gift as a seer, having at his disposal the Urim and Thummim. Okay, so to wrap up, again, I know that was sort of a whirlwind tour, but to just sort of wrap up here and reiterate a few things. So what have I drawn from this? And I'm glad to see that we'll be sort of ending on time, it looks like, which is good. Early Latter-day Saints understood that the ability of a seer like Joseph Smith to translate ancient records was because God had given him revelation to do so. That is very clear throughout these sources and the others I have looked at, right? There is a consistent and unmistakable pattern that I detect in early Latter-day Saint publications and in early Latter-day Saint discourse that uses words such as revelation, inspiration, and translation almost interchangeably, or sometimes explicitly interchangeably, to describe Joseph Smith's scriptural texts, right? Therefore, to somehow suggest that these figures, guys like Orson Pratt and others, John Whitmer and others, to suggest that they were somehow sort of sheepishly conceding the historical authenticity of the Book of Mormon, or that they were sort of backing away strategically from calling it a translation because, oh, the evidence is just so overwhelming, that betrays a complete and fundamental ignorance of how Latter-day Saints have received and discussed and presented the Book of Mormon, right? Related to that, to accuse Elder Suarez of gaslighting, it's absurd. It's frankly absurd, and again betrays a total ignorance of the reception history of the Book of Mormon. It betrays a fundamental ignorance of how Latter-day Saints have talked about the Book of Mormon. And so I don't know what to tell people if they haven't heard it described it that way. I don't know what to tell them because it is demonstrably in the historical record that Latter-day Saints have long been very, very comfortable to talk about the Book of Mormon in these terms. And so to accuse Elder Suarez of somehow gaslighting or whatever, I suppose it says more about the intellectual achievements and abilities of the person making the accuser than Elder Suarez, right? So to make to bring all this together, to answer the question, is the Book of Mormon a translation or a revelation, which I pose at the outset of this paper, the answer that I give to this is yes. Yes, it's both. And Latter-day Saints are completely fine and completely at home to use both terms to describe this book that they have. So to conclude, I'll conclude with William Appleby, another important early Latter-day Saint who has some interesting writings on the early Restoration. I'll conclude with what he says in an 1856 article. Thanks and praise be given to him who rules on high and sways the destinies of men. He has spoken from the heavens in these days, raised up a prophet, seer, and revelator who has by commandment and the aid of the Urim and Thummim and the power of inspiration translated and brought back and restored the most plain and precious things that have been taken away by uninspired men under the authority of a corrupt and apostate church, so that the saints of latter days know, understand, and comprehend truth from error and the inspiration of the Almighty from the wisdom of men. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. That was absolutely fascinating. The first comment that I have for you is
Sure.
a comment from somebody who is watching. They just wanted to let you know that they appreciate that you going through all the anti-Mormon websites and using the modern terms as a real-life example of what we might come up against and how to combat those claims. Said it was very helpful and something you see all the time on the internet and social media.
I hope to be helpful, so they're welcome, yes. I'll take one for the team and slog through these lamentable websites, of which there are many, but you know, it's a necessary duty, I guess.
Unfortunately, yeah. So, you spoke a lot about Joseph and Oliver having a gift to write, keys, etc., to translate. Why do you think we don't often see those same gifts today?
Well, I suppose, strictly speaking, those gifts still exist in the sense that the 15 men we sustain as prophets, seers, and revelators have the right to exercise those gifts. I assume that if or when the sealed plates are brought forth or other records are brought forth, there is no shortage of men down at Temple Square who would be responsible and who'd have the divine charge of handling those records, right? So that's what I would say is... obviously, we're waiting to see what happens in the future, perhaps during the millennium, or who knows, right? But the office of prophet, seer, revelator still rests with 15 men down in downtown Salt Lake City. The keys of those gifts still rest with them. And so why we don't see more records being brought forth by them, I would say it's beyond my pay grade to answer that question. There's other people I would direct that question to, since it's not my place to say that we're supposed to get more records right now. But I fully believe that they have the keys to those gifts and those abilities, which they will operate at their discretion as God directs them.
All right, fantastic. So, when Joseph said that the Book of Mormon was dictated to him by God, how literally do you take that? Do you favor a loose or a tight translation?
Yeah, that's a great question. That raises the question, okay, so what does Joseph Smith understand about the nature of the specific English text he's receiving, right? I think that that's a separate question about what manner of translation is this, right? Tight versus loose. I actually think that it's kind of a false dichotomy, but for want of time, we won't get into it too much here. What I think, at a minimum, what this says is that Joseph Smith believes clearly the translation is given to him by God, or the power to translate, the ability to translate is given to him by God. That's kind of the minimum threshold I see from statements like this. What implications that has for the actual nature of the translation is a good question, but it's one that is outside the scope of this present paper of mine and our present discussion, and so it's something perhaps to discuss more long-term down the road.
Okay. And lastly, since you are one of our top Book of Abraham experts these days, how does this research that you did today relate to the Book of Abraham?
I'm glad we get a little Book of Abraham shout out there, right? I would be remiss if I did not somehow tie in the Book of Abraham. I will just say very briefly, in an expanded version of this paper, I draw in the Book of Abraham too, as another example. So I do both Book of Mormon and Book of Abraham. And once again, the language used by early Latter-day Saints to describe the Book of Abraham is pretty similar, if not identical, to how they describe the Book of Mormon. And so they go back and forth between calling this a revelation and a translation. Again, I believe, and I showed the example of Orson Pratt who does that, right? In his 1856 publication, he explicitly lumps them all together. Book of Mormon, JST, D&C 7, Book of Abraham, Book of Moses, right? He lumps all of these together. These fall under the spiritual gift of translation / revelation / seership that Joseph is given by God. So in a full version, future version of this paper, I can show that Latter-day Saints are describing the Book of Abraham the same way they're describing the Book of Mormon. Even to the point that Joseph Smith, at least once on record, he also describes the Book of Abraham as a translation. In the Times and Seasons in 1842, not long after the book is published. He, at least on one occasion, publicly calls it a revelation as well. So basically, what I can say in a nutshell is everything I've said for the Book of Mormon today, from my research, also applies to the Book of Abraham. The only way Joseph is able to translate anything, because he is not learned in ancient languages through secular academic means, the only way he can translate anything is through a revelatory gift from God. That goes for gold plates, that goes for Egyptian papyri, that goes for anything from antiquity that's brought to him that he's working with.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much.